Welcome everyone. My name is Ajit Zadgaonkar. I'm part of AWS Professional Services. I lead the global DevOps practices. And as a part of my role, I travel across the globe, meet with different executives, and talk to them about how efficiently they can utilize DevOps processes and they can benefit from cloud. And as a part of that, a lot of interesting discussions come in is how do they actually start to benefit from day one. And here with me is Mike.
Hi, how are you? Nice to see everybody today. Thanks, Ajit. My name is Mike Eshu, and I'm a migration leader and technically delivery manager on the AWS Managed Services product. And we focus on helping customers onto AWS Managed Services, or AMS as we'll refer to it throughout the presentation, and operate based on our platform on behalf of our customers.
Awesome. So it's interesting, Mike, that you mentioned you're part of AMS team and you deal with a lot of customers as well and really helping them migrate into AWS and really gain efficiency from that. Is there a common theme that they usually come to you ask help for?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the common theme, almost every one of the customers we're working with wants to go fast. I want to migrate quickly. You know, there's some point of inflection. Maybe it's a data center closure. Maybe a lease is up, or maybe a hardware refresh needs to happen, and customers are looking to defer a physical hardware refresh and use that as an opportunity to migrate to the cloud for those table stake applications while they simultaneously open up opportunities for innovation.
Making me chuckle reminds me of days when I was responsible for this hardware refresh and managing data centers.
Huge business cases, right? To advocate for that big spend.
When we decided to go onto all-in cloud, all-in AWS, this was 2013, 2014 timeframe. And the challenge was same is where do you start? How do you get in there? And thinking about it, in my mind, there were three fundamental phases of it. One was how do you create this basic foundation that way you can start using the foundation and build on it. And some of these foundation could be how do I have my security, how do I have my network, are there common storage practices or storage systems in there. So those are the interesting ones that comes part of the foundation. And then once that is ready, then the second step was then you're ready for migrating the workloads. And once you migrate it, the third is how do I now gain more operational excellence on it? Is that a common theme that you see as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, we are always advocating for our customers to think about how they're going to move through each one of those phases, the different skills, the different stakeholders that need to be engaged through all of these phases, and then continuously as migration programs go on. And of course, once you start migrating workloads, indeed, whether you're ready for it or not, you're indeed operating those workloads that you migrated.
Yeah, it's interesting is how important it is really to have your solid foundation before you actually start thinking about migrating workloads. And when you start thinking about migrating workloads, another important thing is what do you migrate first? How do you migrate it? And do you really wait for the full migration to happen really cloud ready, or do you start to migrate in bits and pieces and optimize those? In my experience, over the years when we started to learn about how to migrate, it was interesting is to start with something that's minimally viable. And over the years we refined it. So let's jump a little bit detail on it. So there is obviously two big spectrum. One is move whatever is there exactly like a data center migration. Another is really gain the benefit from cloud. From your perspective, where is the pendulum in between?
Yeah, and I think that's what's challenging is that on one hand, right, you would ideally think about adopting cloud, stateless applications that can be auto-scaled, auto-healed. A lot of the other techniques that you use when you go through a well-architected review, of course, we're driving you to adopt those cloud capabilities that give you, potentially resiliency, operational excellence, security. And that would be the ideal state, though oftentimes the business pressure driving you out of the data center, asking you to lift and shift quickly, or maybe even perhaps the type of applications we're talking about. You're being asked to exit a data center, you're using commercial off-the-shelf products. And it doesn't make sense to work with the application manufacturer or the software developer who may no longer be selling the software, but it's a business, it's an application of business importance to your business. So you're actually unable to get those in a well-architected, highly available state based on limitations of the application. And so lift and shift is what we'll often advocate for customers looking to move substantial portions of their estate from on-prem to cloud. And then later think through optimization once you're getting that data from the cloud and so on. So that's typically our position. And so the question, of course, that we're here to talk about today is like, what are ways of doing that? What are some of the tactics and techniques that help you get to cloud? More biased to that lift and shift, but perhaps we'd advocate that given you're moving, there's an opportunity to look at those applications, perhaps modernize them. So think about OS modernization if you're using, Red Hat Linux 5 or Windows 2003 R2. Maybe this is an interesting time to modernize those and start adapting cloud tools that go very nicely with those legacy or traditional applications that you're going to move to the cloud. So, of course, you have some experience doing this. So I'd love to hear some of the tactical techniques you've used in doing some of this activity and some of your former roles.
Yeah, absolutely. The most important thing here that you called it out very nicely is minimum viable refactoring. And it's important to understand and dive deeper a little bit so we are clear on what we're talking about. When you say minimum viable refactoring, are you refactoring the whole thing, or you're looking at minimum pieces that are needed for you to refactor so you can move your application, you can move your workloads, or you can move your infrastructure into cloud so you can start benefiting from day one. And in talking about it, it may lead to the fastest path to the cloud. So if you want to wait until you want to refactor everything, you want to get everything from well-architected perspective, it may take a lot of time. And you may be up against the time where your leases are getting over or your hardware refresh is closing on you. So it's important to understand those concepts. And I happen to be in a similar clutch a couple years ago where not only we knew exact date when we had to move out of our data centers, we were getting kicked out from there for our growth. And at the same time,
certainly the why, right? Had to move, no choice.
Yeah, we had to move, no choice, but we had so much of time in our hands, so we knew that needed to happen. But the typical problem was there were lots of applications that many of them we didn't even have touched them for a long time. Then there are COTS applications were designed with how we had architected our data center. So a lot of those interesting things came up. And a little bit of financial reasons as well. If you look on my slides here, drawing you there. So when we were doing our calculations, what happened was initially we estimated that the top line, that's our overall on-premises cost going to be. We knew that we could optimize, we could renegotiate our contract on storage and compute and others, so over time it would have dropped a little bit. We also estimated our cloud costs, so that's the dotted yellow line. And what we were after is how do we start hitting and going into cloud sooner and also start optimizing, so we don't want to wait for years to refactor. So the goal here was how do you use lift and shift, also refactor in between, so you start to hit the ground running and start benefiting from day one. And where we ended up is you can see the solid yellow line at the bottom, and we were able to uncover additional savings that we didn't actually think about earlier when we planned it. And that was a significant 39-40% is a significant benefit to the business. Not only that, there is a significant benefit on how we operated with excellence. So when you think about operational excellence, when you think about minimum viable refactoring, it's not just lift and shift and make it just work. I think that's definitely one of the goals, but how do you work in a way that you can constantly start benefiting from day one, and you can build a foundation that you can build your story on top of it. So those were fundamental things that we were trying to do, and that was the big challenge is where do you start? How do you go it? How do you start benefiting from day one? And those are very interesting. And I came from Edmonds there, and that's where I led this all migration. And this is how we did it. And for the most part, we called it our 2-week refactor rule. So this was interesting is in the scheme of things, you're trying to figure out what do I do first? How do I move the needle? So in the vein of things, this was one of the things that I authored with my team, that guys, let's figure out a way where we are constantly incremental way, we are moving things and benefiting from it, and we called it 2-week refactor rule. It's like 2-minute rule.
2 weeks to migrate an application or an instance or a database. What was the thing that happened in 2 weeks?
Well, there were a lot of things, and one of the example is we had Red Hat operating system, and we wanted to migrate away from Red Hat and use Amazon Linux. So in 2 weeks, we picked up a couple applications. Can we actually bake in and create applications that can work on Amazon Linux?
So an operating system replatform, for business reasons, it sounds like.
Right, and another example is how do you go about in creating a connection in cloud with your LDAP servers? You still need to have something where you can authenticate against.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm definitely keen to talk about access management, because moving to the cloud opens up all new vectors of opportunities around access management, right? So how are you going to do it today versus what do you want to advantage as you move into the cloud?
Right, so first was some of the basic things that we need for applications and our workloads to run, and that's the fundamentals, foundation tier, like how do you create a network? Does network have the right permissions? Do you have the right storage? You don't want to go and have everyone create their own storage. You want to have organizational policies, and you want to make sure that all applications can talk to them. And then once the foundation tier was ready, then you start thinking about, okay, this foundation is ready for my 40% of applications or 50% of applications. Then we use the same thing to migrate applications. Once the applications migrated, we use the same mechanism, 2-week refactor rule, to gain the operational excellence on them. So the idea was to, again, going back, is have the small chunks of workload in a definite period of time. That way not only we can measure and quickly find out if things are going wrong, but also make progress. So if they go well, and for the most part they did go well, you start benefiting from day one, and you can start building on top of the foundation to start moving workloads that matters.
Sure.
Yeah. So talking a little bit about 2-week refactor rule, it was interesting. We broke it down to like a couple steps. And when we started, day 1 and 2 has always been, how do you find out about workloads? How do you find out about the applications or the foundation tier? For an example, how do I know what my LDAP servers are doing? And another example, if you're thinking about application, is what all places that the application connects to. Does it connect to a storage? Does it connect to a database? Does it connect to FTP server? Yeah, there could be many combinations that is doing. What foundation is running on? It's Java application, .NET application, Node, Python. There are, in enterprise place, there are many variations that happen. So day 1 and 2 was significant investment using tools and techniques to find out what are we trying to deal with. So the technology and the moving pieces, some of the COTS applications as well. And we used some of the APM solutions as well that gave us a nice map of things that were running, what they were connecting to, but it came up, it gave us a nice map of what you're trying to do. And then we figured out, oh, what we're talking about is moving a storage system. And an example of that is we were using NFS in our data center, so all applications were logging in there. And back in the day, there was no NFS solution. AWS EFS came in afterwards. So how do you go about changing all applications, or is it worth changing that? So, but day 1 and 2 was important from that perspective, is you know what you're dealing with. And then you have a clear map of what are the moving pieces. And over time, as you start to put them into a place, you can have a list of libraries. Then you know the second time, oh yeah, this was the similar problem we dealt with last month, and what did we do about it?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about, like templating. Like I imagine the first time the team did this, they quickly realized like, oh, we should have a form, right? And maybe it's a simple web form where we can collect these things we know are going to hit us every time. How is networking going to work? How is isolation going to work? How is access management going to differ from what we're doing today?
Yeah, as the name says, 2-week refactor rule, but I still remember the first sprint or the idea of that we were running. It did go into.
You probably didn't call it that when you first started doing it. You didn't know how long it would be.
It took about 3 weeks, and but at the end of the day, we were still successful. And towards the mature side of the things, we were wrapping things up in 4 and 5 days. And earlier, when we started, every team member was trying to deal with one problem. And over time, we created templates and found out lots of patterns. I still remember, I think we had like 45 different patterns, and each member was able to migrate workloads by themselves over time. And we used similar methodology when we moved into containerization. We were able to migrate lots of applications based on these templates. So you start with a planning, you start identifying patterns and start optimizing it. Over time, once you have template, you can gain momentum and gain
that continuous improvement strikes me as so important to develop those templates. If you're starting from no templates or starting from no patterns, well, that's okay. You got to build that content, but just how important continuous improvement is. Sure.
Right. So another important part that came out of day 1 and 2 is just cataloging and registry of things that were being used on our applications. And very quickly we found out there were a lot of things that were duplicate. And that was overlapping into day 3 and 4, as well as the same application using log4j version X and another using same libraries being used the Java application POM management is another version. So there were lots of cleanup opportunities that presented us. So let me move us to the next slide. Day 3 and 4. So I call it cleanup, but this was interesting because these were really optimization opportunities. I don't necessarily look at it as a cleanup, but there were lots of things you can find out. So if you're talking about Java applications, you're using Spring Boot. Over time, if you haven't touched applications, there may be a lot of runtime properties that you did override about it. And these were overrides probably good for your data center, and doesn't make sense. No one had time to go back and clean it up or fit it. So that was another opportunity. And runtime properties always gets to me when I see a list of things and still get me.
I think that's important around, are you just migrating your technical debt to the cloud, right? And it's kind of like almost like moving house, right? Am I going to, discard old stuff? Do I throw my trash away, or do I let the movers pack it?
And most likely,
it's a great opportunity.
Right, and most likely you're using either Chef, Ansible, or one of those things to manage artifacts and your infrastructure.
Standardization opportunity.
Right, so there is a significant opportunity there as you're moving into cloud that you can actually find out things that can be probably deprecated, retired, or are not going to be relevant anymore when we go in there. So we started making list of things that needed to be cleaned up, and down the line after a couple months, it actually helped us migrate away from Chef into OpsWorks. So we cleaned up from thousands of cookbooks, we came back to probably hundreds. So that was a significant opportunity, but it all comes with step one, where you're deliberately cataloging things, what is being used. And second, you start to think about what are the things that you can clean up. And logging is always interesting one.
Sure.
You can find applications that are logging at info level. There are applications that logging at error level. There are applications that are not logging at all.
So implementing that logging standard, always coming back to like improving that template, it sounds like. No, how are we going to address logging? There's the way that we're trying to get everybody on, and then there's an exception process if you can't do it. Why? Why is it going to take so long to switch your logging methodology to be aligned with some corporate standard?
Yeah, and going into cloud, we knew that security is paramount important thing for us to consider, and we realized that we had applications that had elevated access. So this was also included part of our cleanup, and we marked it, we need to go back and revisit.
That one resonates with me a lot. I see that almost every time, right? Our customers will tell us, no, like everything access management's in great shape, and we impart upon the customer demand to adopt some new access management methodologies. And every single time, I think customers have been surprised by local administrated users that have been left with someone who'd left the company 5 years ago, and it becomes quite a surprise. Well, as it turns out, taking the time when you're migrating to refresh the access management and the privileges that you've given a given instance is pretty important.
Yeah, what happens is, if I correlate with what I had done in the past, is once you have the foundation tier, you start just focusing on applications and workloads. Usually you do not go back and changing your foundation tier, because everyone you have granted access, you have provided the foundation tier. So no one really takes time to go back.
You've done it once. You just now need to get these applications to adopt and integrate with that foundation.
Yeah, so important thing was to really start cataloging things, finding those opportunities where the cleanup can happen, and then identify those so you can work on it. And then obviously step 3 was Cloudify application.
Cloudification process.
Yeah, this was pretty cloudy. We didn't know what to do back then. We had ideas about it, but these were the most intense days, because first you identified list of things from day 1 into day 3 and 4. You identified things that were clean up. Now this is where you actually make the change. And these were very tiring and intense days, because we didn't know what you're going. For an example, you're going to go rev up a Java version that was being used. I still remember 1.6 to going to 1.8 or 1.7.
When you can rattle them off like that, it's been intimate. Yeah.
Right. It's so you are not only changing POM files, but can you actually successfully build up artifact or application after that? And then once you start building it, then probably, this library is causing a runtime dependency, or another dependency is failing. So from that perspective, they were pretty intense, and real work of changing things happened on day 5 and 6. Many a times, actually, they did go into day 7 as well. But the idea was, once you have a template, once you have identified, can we actually make those minimum changes, and you may have 10 things, but can we actually make 2 of these changes? You don't have to focus on all 10. We'll come back, and next week we'll probably do visit again, and we'll take another 2 and make changes. But the idea here was, how do we make some change and still have application running? It should compile, we should be able to run, it should be able to pass the test. And invariably, when you're making the change, you have to go back and readjust your unit test as well. If you know how
on the application side, absolutely.
Right. So not only unit test, but also now functional test as well. A lot of times, and this is going back to some of the legacy applications, they've been running at a particular URL for months and years, and no one has any change. So many of the tests had hard coding, many of the assumptions were not true anymore.
Right, and hard-coded IPs is something I'll encounter quite often, and we know in private subnets on AWS that can IP stickiness can quickly become an issue.
The other thing that came out during these phases was the security review, which we didn't really think the way we grew up to think about it. Is in data center, you know where your security controls are. We really didn't think about, well, can we have a security group talking to those? You would always be configuring them through the firewall rules, and you can have.
Well, and think about all the audit processes security had in place, right? They're auditing firewall rules. Now that control has moved to the AWS account, the AWS security group, and the NACLs in the AWS account.
Right. So again, coming back to day 5 and 6 was the significant work where you are not only changing or dropping the libraries, like I mentioned, Log4j, different versions are popping in within the same code through the runtime dependencies, or you're going back and tweaking your security groups to make sure that applications are right on a right foundation. You might even think about, oh yeah, I already moved my databases from on-prem to RDS, so I need to go back and change those strings. Does it still compile?
Sure.
Can it still connect? And once you go through that, you change your test, you make sure that you still have the coverage. And coverage was another thing where I wish I can go back and do a little bit better there. But when we made the change, we just wanted to make sure it compiles and test passes, so we are ready. At least we can deploy it.
Well, I think that's why I like the 2-week rule, right? You've got to time box yourself. You need to move on to meet the business goal of migrating out of the data center. You're obviously not going to come out of it with 100% test coverage, and it might not make sense to come out of it with 100% test coverage, given the timeline.
So one of the questions that came in from one of our audiences, can we talk about what type of people were involved in each step?
Sure.
So in my case, what we came up with is a team, and for the most part, that was a full stack team. So not only these people knew fundamentals of networking, they knew fundamentals of storage, so we can talk about why use S3 in this case, why use EBS volume, and how to restore a snapshot. But at the same time, these people knew how Tomcat works. They also knew what Nginx is for that matter. They knew what HA proxies for that matter. They knew what load balancers are. They knew what round robin is. But they were the same people who knew they may not be the best Java architects or experts, but they could open the POM file, they can understand how it works.
So they were able to work between the infrastructure and the application layer.
Right.
And then that also makes me think about another webinar. I think the last one you and I did was about enterprise DevOps patterns of efficiency. And one of the patterns you covered, I mean, it wasn't just constrained to the technical staff. I recall you explaining deep integration with the finance team and, of course, the security team, which you've already mentioned.
Right. So we had this crack team of 8 to 10 people, but it wasn't important the number. The important thing there was, do we have the right skill set from starting from taking an application at the foundation tier all the way to operations. And whenever we didn't have a right skill, we would go back to our development team and say, hey guys, we need a little bit of help. But for the most part, over time, we didn't have to go back, and we knew. And using APM solutions was a blessing because we could see what's happening. And when we went back to our development team, we had a very specific questions that, hey, this query is having a problem after we migrated to RDS. Or we have a specific line is a problem when we are logging to EBS or containers for that matter. So we had a lot more focused questions when we were asking for help. But going back to the question that came up, it was more about generic set of skill set. Some of them were experts on the networking side, some of them were experts on the storage side. We did have the security guys as well, but all of them knew how to code, all of them knew how to debug an application, all of them knew how to deploy, all of them knew how to use CI/CD paradigm. Some of them were not experts of writing unit tests, some of them were, But we created this list of things that we needed within our team. So
You'll also often see AWS referred to as that cloud center of excellence and pulling in the right folks at the right step. Obviously, during planning, that's where perhaps financing, compliance, risk is going to be more interested. And then when you're actually on step 3, days 5 and 6, it's very much technically focused, and then security is involved in ensuring that you're implementing things.
Right, you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is incrementally adding value. And if you were to revisit and redo everything, which may happen in early stages, but you want to avoid too much going back and forth. So it's important to involve everyone that you can, but at the same time, it cannot be a 300 people team that you are getting distracted and you are not able to make any progress. So we created this very small empowered team that had access, that had knowledge, and they were empowered to make progress. We also had support from our executives, and we had support from our managers as well. And the support allowed us to take certain risk. For an example, if application didn't compile, no one was coming and banging our head. And they knew that what we are dealing with is a lot of backlog of years, and also what was in front of us was more important, is getting there and start benefiting from once we moved there. So there were times when people got a little bit anxious, and but we worked through that. Having organization support, having support from finance team was important, because they could see that we are expanding our AWS spend. And there was a reason, as long as we could explain why we need it, when we need it, it was cordial for most part.
And you mentioned, obviously this step is cloudification of applications, and we're talking about minimum viable refactor. So how did you balance? Did you ever try to take on too much cloudification? Like maybe you considered moving off, Memcache that you were hosting, thinking about going to Elasticache, the AWS service, right? Did you ever try to bite off a little bit much and roll back?
Yeah.
And have to move on because you had time boxed yourself, or did that work out for you?
Yeah, combination of those. Almost every time we try to take too much off.
We try to just really well architect into a cloud native application.
No,
because it would have been ideal.
Yes, but there was just so much in front of us that we wanted to change, because we had very clear vision that once we get in there, we wanted to operate well. We didn't want to have alerts flying all over. We wanted to focus on what matters most and what differentiates us versus just managing infrastructure. So in our list of things, we had a huge laundry list and we had a huge wish list. So we were just ambitious. We would want to change all of our logging, go to S3. We would want to change everything to DynamoDB, or we would want to change our caching tier to be Redis.
Caching,
right?
Sure.
What happened was, as you go into day 5 and 6, that's when you have a realization and a root.
It's either going to work, or you're going to need to follow perhaps the established strategy.
So the descoping part usually happen in that phase, because once you're making the change, then oh yeah, I made the change, but none of my tests are passing, or I made the change, but it's not working out. Sure. So you have to roll back your change and say, okay, looks like I'm going to be able to make only 2 out of 10 that I wanted to do, but are these 2 really working out? Can I still go ahead and
highest value changes, right? And essentially I'd say you're seeking the minimum, right? Or you're attempting for the maximum, but demanding that you hit some level of minimum, that template or that checklist. That, hopefully, and you made me think as you were describing what you're doing, hopefully you're building up that script that was sort of doing some of the modernization for you as you came over.
Got it. And then finally, not finally, but the next progression was... basically, when you have the application compiled,
does it work?
Does it work? So you deploy
for real in production, right?
And you deploy and see what really happens. So this was interesting phase where you would actually deploy. Maybe it's working. It's working, but it's not really performant, and you can't really take it out to production. It's working, but there is too much of failing, or it's crashing every now and then, and over time you just know what's happening. But initial first couple iterations that we did, it was a nightmare, because not only you made the change, but you're trying to make it work and it's not performing the way you want it.
And by the way, the next migration wave is knocking at your doorstep. You're supposed to start migrating the next application as it relates to your wave plan.
Yeah, going back and in introspection, I think most of the issues were because the cookbooks and the foundation tier that we were using with Chef, we didn't really think too far. So most of the changes came back to, I need to go back and update my cookbook. I need to go back and change my recipe or change my role. Over time that got resolved, but I think that was a learning curve where we needed to figure out And then as we started to tweak them, they got better at it.
Yeah, I see that with my customers as well, especially like, we might have something running in production, and then you have, I often say, like the burn-in issues that happen a week or two after production cutover. When we learn that maybe we missed a hard-coded IP, we need to do some patching, we have degraded instances, and we go and reboot those instances. They come up with a new IP address, and we discover, oops, we missed something, right? And we have that incident that we have to manage through.
So that's
after we've cut over to production, and that happens especially early on in migrations where we haven't learned all those, I'll call it cloudy ways of working.
So basically, what happens when the rubber hits the road?
Exactly, right? But I call it post-migration incident management. And it's classic operations, right? Incident management still needs to occur despite the fact you're a migration team.
Right. So then moving on to day 8, 9, and 10, this is where the rubber meets the road. And they were really eye-openers for us. Not only application passed, it compiled, it got deployed, but then does it really meet the SLAs that we were trying for? And does it really give us the operational efficiency? And by this time you come there, you have fairly good degree of confidence then that you can tweak things. A lot of findings that we did was either using a lot more compute resources than they needed. On the flip side, not giving as much as they needed.
Sure.
So and data
easy change in cloud, fortunately.
Well, we had to change and learn how to operate more optimally. So in our data center, all the gears were already bought in. We had invested money. So if someone comes, hey, my application is running slow, throw more hardware at it. And we would give like as many CPU cores you want. And here when you come back and say, oh, this application I have given it 5 core and it probably doesn't need 6 core and it doesn't need that much, or 4 core, it doesn't need that much. Same thing, your application is giving 16 gig of RAM, but it doesn't need that much. Maybe it needs only 4. So why waste that money and waste your resource? On the flip side, there are a few things that really worked very well in our data center because we didn't pay attention. We were giving whatever it needed to run.
Made the capital purchase. Right?
And then as soon as they hit the cloud, we saw that, oh, we thought it needs only 2 gig, but honestly, for it to run well and not crash, we needed a little bit more. So we had to go back and adjust both of them. And then the second thing that came is the class of instance we were using. Network can be interesting. Are you using network optimized instances? Are you using EBS volume? What happens if the application crashed? Can you recover it faster? Do you have to start from scratch? And also really start thinking about auto scaling and start benefiting from what cloud natively provides. So by this time, because we were seeing those problems, the issue was how do we learn from it, and how do we make it so if it fails again, no one needs to spend time on it, it automatically recovers. So it forced us to rethink our strategy and start thinking about auto healing and self-recovery, and that's where it came up next week.
Well, I think those are those continuous improvement opportunities that are driving you to get well architected after you've done that minimum viable refactor, right? One of the things that's informing you, of course, is all the data. So AWS Trusted Advisor are making recommendations on instance sizing, seeing that underutilization of compute. And so now the cloud is giving you the data you need to drive optimization that would have been really difficult, in my opinion, to do during the migration. Right? You need to collect the data through runtime to trigger those continuous operations processes, continuous improvement
Absolutely
processes.
Right. So what happened is after running this couple iterations within a couple of teams and dealing with several applications in foundation tier or workloads, we came up with a list of things that we started to ask questions. Is it, an example is it a web app? Is it internal or public facing app? Is it a Java app or Node.js app?
Sure.
What version of Java it's using?
Template for questionnaire. Sure.
Then what type of runtime properties does it have? Then what log libraries it has? Or does it need a different type of memory? Or does it use a in-memory cache like Guava cache, or you want a Redis cache, or different things? Then on the other side, is it a standalone app? We had a lot of standalone apps. Is it moving data? Does it require enterprise publishing bus connection? So where are your queues? Do you want to migrate the queues? So then at the first year, is it a web app? Second is, if it's not a web app, or is it a connected app versus a standalone app? And then third was, is it a foundation tier app? Like admin or system apps. An example of that is the system helps us do the authentication. Your single sign-on, for example, or is it access control that you're doing, or is it is it an internal tool that we're using for infrastructure setup, or LDAP, or even CDN, WAF? There were lots of those applications.
So many considerations. It makes me wonder. You had this 2-week period. Why 2 weeks? I feel like we need to do a 10-week minimum viable refactoring. What drove you to get to 2 weeks?
Well, it was an accidental find. So what really happened is, when we started to do that, we got tired of meeting after meeting and 30-40 people in room and trying to figure out where do we want to start. So it started with my team going in isolation and saying that, okay, while we are still attending the meeting, we're still debating, can we actually move and make some progress? And see if we can benefit from it. And we labeled it as, oh, we are going to start building a DR site for ourselves. If something goes wrong, we can still serve from cloud. And that was our strategy. We are going to use DR first. We were going to build a DR. And if DR worked well, then we have an active site that we can serve traffic from. So that was very interesting. So it started with those. And 2 weeks was just right size enough. In some cases, we did go to 3 weeks, and on the mature side, we were wrapping up. No one was worried about 2 weeks. Each member in the team, they were independently migrating applications and workloads and creating those. But 2 weeks was just about right, because if something went wrong, we wanted to have time, especially when rubber hits the road, like day 8, 9, 10. That's when a lot of things will come out. So you want to have some time. And if it didn't work, then you can, if you're taking a modular approach, whatever did not work out, you can just take it out, and whatever worked, move forward with those. But it also gave you time to do course correction right after that. If you do, like, let's say 6-week cycle, then it just takes 6 weeks for you to know.
You're not getting to production, right? So you're not collecting that data. Yeah, exactly. So that makes sense.
Cool. So it sounds like a lot of things that you're doing is similar. When customers ask you is, how do I get there, on AMS side as well? What's you mentioned that common theme is again similar, is how do I get there? How do I get there fast? And how do I gain excellence?
Sure, yeah. And so, I mean, it helps to give a little bit background on what AMS does. And so given sort of the tactics and techniques that you just described with that, the 2-week refactor, minimum viable refactor approach, key is establishing that foundation. And so from an AMS perspective, when we're working with customers, we go through an onboarding process that actually includes all those phases of foundations, migration, and operation, and helping teach those customers those ways of working. So here on the slide, we have that it takes 120 days to onboard to AMS. What does that really mean? And I think it's worth thinking about AMS. Not only, you could work with AMS. We provide a product where we take on additional operational responsibility. We adjust that shared responsibility model, and we take on operating AWS infrastructure for customers who'd like us to look after that with our automation platform. And so what happens at 120 days, we're really building the foundation, making the agreements with security, finance, compliance, application development teams, migration teams, other dependent infrastructure teams like networking, access management, and so on, in assuring we're set up to go fast. And so as I get into that, let's go to the next one. What are the processes that we focus on during establishing foundations and ways of working in AWS managed services?
I think an important part is also to understand, when we talk about foundation, there's a lot that you can conveniently not think about it, and the focus should be around while migrating, but migrating with governance, compliance, and security in place.
Exactly. Pre-negotiated, right? The time to be negotiating with compliance isn't after production cutover, right? You want to establish those ways of working that you can reuse, templatize, and automate time and time again as you work through.
It is so difficult to come back and rechange your access tier versus building from grounds up. Some of the things that back in the day we were working with enterprise support and security architects that AWS extended, and they taught us start with the minimal permissions and make sure that you're doing in a way that you can not only govern, but you can make sure that it's compliant with organization policy, and it's still in line with where you want to go, is operational excellence. So an important part is to really keep that as your foundation and keep revisiting that every time in every iteration. You cannot think that, I'm going to come back after 3 weeks and take audit of my security posture. It needs to be revisited. It needs to be audited with every new workload. That way you will be better off.
Indeed. Indeed, and I think so much of that is automatable, right? So if you're thinking about those large tranches of applications, just as you were alluding to in your two-week factor approach, we sort of in AMS, we've kind of established what our minimum viable refactor is, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. We fully codified it, so you just call an automation routine that's going to do a bunch of tooling change out to cloud native tooling. And so in order to do that, well, let me take us through the processes so you sort of get what AMS is trying to introduce.
Yeah.
And then I'll sort of weave in some of the themes around how different techniques to that minimum viable refactor can work.
One of the questions from that just came in from one of the audiences, can we talk about the tools that were involved? So what really happened is when this was going back to 2014 timeframe, when we first thought about going to AWS, the original idea was just basically we were fixated with using compute, network, and storage. We didn't think that we were going to use managed services. But it changed in 3 months or even less than that we were already using 45 different services going in there. So it definitely started with Cloudify.
Well, it always happens logically, right? Oh, by the way, we could just use CloudWatch for log. Where are we going to put this? S3, right? How are we going to search this? Elasticsearch.
Yeah. In our case, it was more about learning through the experience that, you were having a logging, but you have a massive infrastructure that you still have to babysit and spend time on it, versus there is something that's taking away that work, so I can focus on migrating more workloads. So, but quickly listing some of the things besides the basic foundation like EC2 instances, the cloud formation, the WAF, the VPC, the direct connect, Redshift. We were using we migrated our database warehouse there as well. We were using code commit for maintaining our code. But there were other services as well. We started using AWS CDN, CloudFront. We started using Lambda.
All as part of re-architecting those applications.
I mean, I can go on and on, but our dream of keeping only 3 things, network, compute, and storage, didn't last too long. We started using 40, 60 different services very quickly because they started to benefit us. And then S3 became the fastest used service for ourselves, and we were pleasantly surprised that for a fraction of cost compared to what we were having in data center, we all were benefiting, and we didn't have to go back and worry about this data is going to be gone, and S3 provides that durable storage.
Durability, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and we use a similar set of tools within AMS, right? Where and of course tools have come along since then on the operations side, implementing guard duty, Macy, and other security tools, inspector reporting for compliance. So what AMS does, you see on the screen here, provision and configuration management. We're doing that via CFN or via patterns that we vend to the customer through our catalog. Huge for us is incident resolution and monitoring. So any workload being deployed into the AMS environment is going to get deployed with a mandatory CloudWatch alarm set that informs our incident alert and event management processes. And oh, by the way, we have to take the time to do the incident integration with the customer. Can we ensure that we can operate through an incident together even while migration waves are going on? Or sometimes we find incidents can occur before migrations. Maybe we're testing out some tooling that's systematically creating security groups. I remember one incident we worked with a customer where a internet-facing port 22 security group was opened, and that triggered a security incident. They'd put in good incident management processes.
Right.
And fortunately, we had taken the time to do that process integration during the foundation stage. So as we started warming up into the migration phase, we were ready. And then, of course, thinking through how we're going to do patch management in the tools. So often we systematically uninstall the customer's incumbent patch management solution, and then we'll install our own, and we leverage Systems Manager Patch.
Talking about patch management, this was a pain for the most part when you are in data
Patching
center.
is hard. It is undifferentiated, heavy lifting that is so important.
And the AMI factory or the model where you can actually do that, that's a significant benefit for.
And we do both. We'll vend out monthly patched AMIs as well as patch long-running instances, which we find is pretty common with block copied migration techniques.
And so, does it get easier when you go to containers?
I think it can. I think that the applications that I work with mostly, aren't. It is often not worth the investment. Our customers are looking to move hundreds and thousands of applications, and they're using either third-party products or AWS simple migration service, database migration service, and so containerization. I don't see terribly common during the minimum viable refactor phase, but then I do see customers maturing those applications into cloud-ready containerized apps.
Right. So during this journey at Edmunds, eventually we went into heavy on containers, and that simplified overall journey even more. So basically, rolling out any changes was seconds job. All you have to do is templatize it and just push the button, and it goes and takes care of itself. So that's why I was asking.
Sure.
What you're seeing that.
Yeah, we just given that type of applications, they're stateful. It's just and they're dependent on all sorts of libraries that folks aren't quite sure of. So building those containers up has been a challenge for customers looking to do that, at least that I work with. Right. And then even backup and restore, right? And so we do volume snapshotting, both RDS and EC2, but coming up with those backup reports. We always make sure we go and engage the backup team, or we're providing them the reporting that quite likely they need to provide onward to the compliance team, right? So always taking into account that. And reporting all up, right, is really important in terms of the value AMS brings to the foundation party, so that we can migrate and operate effectively.
So one of the question from participant James, a great question, that this sounds like more like a checklist. So what's the difference when you're migrating? On the AMS side, talking about a 2-week refactor rule, we ended up having a large checklist of things that got evolved, and we became mature, and the checklist got connected with templates, and templates became routines, and routine becomes guardrails, and finally the migration. On AMS side, do you guys have something on the similar lines that you can help customers, like pre-engagement, migration, post-migration?
Sure, we don't. So we work with systems integration partners like professional services to lead the development of the migration factory and so on. With AMS, we've codified all of the things we need to check for and implement, right? And of course, we articulate that to the customer and our systems integration partner. But all of things like installing Monet, because that's what we leverage for Linux instances in terms of on-instance performance reporting, or Simple Systems Manager, which we use for access management vectors and remote command execution, as well as patch. We have a series of agentry that we need to ensure is installed, and in fact, some cases our agents for antivirus, for example, may conflict with what's coming over in the migrated block copied workload. And so we systematically execute those via scripting upon ingestion into our environment. We call it our workload ingest service. And so instead of putting that burden into a human checklist, we've just automated that. I still think you need to collect a lot of the parameters that you're doing around auth, what has to be minimum viably refactored. But in terms of everything AMS needs to operate post-migration, we're going to systematically insert, or we're not going to accept the workload into the environment.
I think the important thing is when you talk about your data center to going into cloud, the security, compliance, and governance fundamentally works differently. First, you have a lot more controls that you can really design to make sure that you're secure from get-go, but also you're building an observability from that perspective, so you constantly know what's going on, and you can find out and do the course correction. What are some of the fundamental difference that everyone must think about from your perspective?
I think critical is getting onto cloud tools that are going to bring the data to help you with that refactor. Right, and so let me take you through some of those sort of pain points that we'll see. Right, I think the core message is that when you establish foundation, you need to do it in a way that's both migration and operation ready. So getting to production ready, right? So folks will often say, look, 120 days is painful. I want to get started on day one. I want to start migrating right away. But again, if you haven't engaged those stakeholders, you're quickly going to get stalled by what could be viewed as blockers in the organization. I think if you enable them early, you can call them accelerators or supporters in the organization. And so if you don't do it, it's not going to be production ready, right? And I think that's that first customer pain point. We see customers able to do this within 30 days faster. And if not, at the same time, we'll see customers taking longer. It's really about how long it takes to get the organization ready to move at pace, execute tactics like 2-week minimum viable refactors, or even faster block level copy with heavy automation once you've got that migration factory up and running.
Where were you 5 years ago when I was doing that? I could have just go
we,
back and get
we
you
wish
so
we
you
were
can-
there, indeed.
You could have helped
And
us.
we're giving a lot of prescriptive guidance. So, for example, we're mandating customers choose federated access and domain joined instances to ensure that you're using those corporate credentials. One of the conversations I'm having with customers frequently is, you want to go fast. Have you thought about where you're going to keep your EC2 key pairs and so on, right? We have an answer for that. We drive you to adopt that, and we systematically join those instances coming over to our domain, trusted back to your domain, to take the complexity of auth out of the picture, but a very robust, proven security model that's based on corporate identity that any customer we'd be working with would already have in place. Too fast. So tooling standardization, as I mentioned, we're using that workload ingest service, where we're systematically integrating and deploying our tool set and removing any conflicting tool set as customers bring their instances over, whether they're working with a partner or their internal migration teams.
What kind of tools are these?
We see block level, so tools like simple migration service, database migration service will be used to do the copy. There's several third-party products we'll also see customers using. And then once that data has been copied over and you have running instances, we kind of put it into a pre-production area within the AWS account, and we're able to run those scripts on the instances to make them operable, and then they're now in a production state, even if it's the non-production migration.
Got it.
And then we also use a change management interface because there's several different parties operating within the environment, oftentimes the customer's different staff from security, compliance, risk, and so on, as well as the system integrator that's often brought in to assist with executing the migration, and our own operations team. So we layer a change management interface. It's often frustrating for DevOps folks like yourself.
Yeah.
Hey, I want to go fast. I just want to be able to use AWS natively. And we say, okay, do you promise to remember to implement CloudWatch every time? And we saw the story enough where the system integrator not fully motivated to ensure that the stacks are prepared for operation. So via our change management system, we're able to enforce via CloudFormation parsing or vending of templates, insurance that those CloudWatch alarms are set properly, insurance that we're not just deploying out AWS security groups that are open to the world. So we're able to do preventative controls, which is one of the reasons we use that.
And that leads you to operational excellence as well, right?
Indeed. And so from an operations excellence perspective, really that's our goal with AWS Managed Services. I think organizational alignment across IT domains come out in that continuous improvement, which then yields that operational excellence.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mike. We will hand it back to Scott for opening question answers and opening the floor. So one of the questions came in is, why not just do the lift and shift?
For AMS, we believe we need to position the customer for cloud excellence, leveraging best practice cloud tools like leveraging CloudWatch. And then not just are they lift and shifting if they come to AWS Managed Services, they're actually going to look to us to do the ongoing infrastructure operations. And I believe by standardizing the tooling that we use and the processes that we ask our customers to engage with us upon, yield our ability to drive our automation flywheel, right? We're always automating against the same tool set. So when customers ask us for things, we only want them to ask for something manually once, and we're able to deploy automation content. And because we're doing that across our full customer base, that flywheel can get moving quite quickly.
For me, it's slightly adding to what you mentioned is many times you may want to look at what type of applications you have. Some may be suitable for just absolutely lifting and shifting, and they will work well. Maybe some of the COTS application. But for the most part, because cloud works so differently, it's important to really go back and look at the foundation tier, bake in security, make sure that you have governance in place, make sure that you're providing that visibility and compliance in place, that making those small tweaks will go a long way. So these are, when we talk about refactor, these are not massive refactor. I want to bring us back to, it's a minimum viable refactor that gets you there
2 to 10
and
things.
still be confident about what's running is still helpful, and you can start getting benefit from the cloud. So it's super critical to really scope it very well and really make progress that's gradual and not like I mentioned, you don't try to chew off too much.
Sure.
Over time you will balance it out. But going back to foundation tier, doing it well, making sure the security risk compliance is baked in on everything you're doing, that are more important when you're thinking about refactor, and then you can start changing those for application tiers as well.
Well, it's a perfect lead into one of the questions we got, which is if you had to pick one, what's the single biggest, or the one you'd sort of suggest everybody consider when conducting this refactor? What was the one that you did every time?
Changing the access permissions.
Yeah, I agree. I think access management inherently changes when you go to the cloud, just based on how cloud works. I agree. I'd say access too.
And the second thing, right after that, was really cleaning the applications. When you are in this world of constantly adding new features, you need some time to go back and readjust your applications and really asking, does it have everything that they need? Does it have less? Does it have more? So take that opportunity when you're starting with access permissions. Take that opportunity and make your notes. You may not do it right there, but you may want to come back and start changing it.
Absolutely. And I think when you do that with your security and compliance team, you're really going to ask security and compliance to buy off on a fundamental approach.
Sounds good. Thank you everyone for participating.